Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session. We've got a lively panel for the next hour and a half and looking forward to getting right into it. So this session is titled Federal, State, National Priorities and Provincial Funding, Research Funding Challenges Across Canada. So we're going to jump right in and get started. So as an overview, what we're here to do to make sure you are in the right session is that this will be a discussion on the roles of provincial and federal research agency in setting priorities, the coordinating of funding, and serving the needs of regional research ecosystems. So I want to start first, though, by giving you a brief note about Research Nova Scotia. So my name is Stefan Leslie. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Research Nova Scotia. And my organization is an independent not-for-profit corporation that supports research across disciplines, including health, natural and social sciences, engineering, and the humanities in Nova Scotia. As part of our legislation that established the organization, our mandate is to support, organize, and coordinate the funding of research in Nova Scotia. And so we are engaged both in the direct arrangement of research of interest in the province, and we are also the organization that provides partnership or match funding for a variety of federal agency initiatives, including CFI. And then we have a broader mandate to engage with the research community in Nova Scotia to generally increase the interest and demand and uptake of research activity for matters in the province. And what you see on the left-hand panel there is the cover page of the Provincial Research Strategy, which we released just over a year ago in October of 2020, which is called A Mission-Oriented Approach to Research. And I know that there's been a lot of conversation about mission-driven or mission-oriented, even at this conference. But the reason we have adopted this approach is that it begins with the sense of accomplishment, the outcome, outside of the research community, so something within society, be it economic or social or otherwise, as the starting point, and then moves back into the research community to build an agenda with partners to actually achieve those goals. And so we are using this approach to work on a variety of complex challenges through coordination and creativity. And the reason why I spend some time on this, and if you're interested, we do have this on our website, is that for us and for those who provide our funding in the provincial government, their interest is ensuring that research is being driven towards producing outputs that can be applied for improving the lives of people in this province. So while there is certainly an understanding of the value of research in increasing our understanding of a variety of complex systems and phenomena in society and the natural environment, there is very much a focus and a desire to ensure that a portion of research at least, and certainly the lion's share of what the province is directly supporting, that will go in favor of things that need to be accomplished. So a couple of opening thoughts to set the scene. The first is that when we are talking about federal research agencies, and so we're talking about the tri-agencies, SSHRC, NSERC, and CIHR, but also the Canada Foundation for Innovation, Genome Canada, and there are others, and provincial agencies, of which each province has one in a various form or another. They tend to take a slightly different, they're expressed slightly different. Some are separate, like us, as a not-for-profit. Others are part of a government agency or department. Some provide more focus on match funding, and others have a broader mandate, like we do. And others are subject focused, so they may be involved specifically in economic development, or they may have a broader mandate. And so there's a significant diversity when you look across all 10 provinces and the territories of how provincial engagement in research has occurred and continues to occur. But both levels of government fund research, both directly and indirectly. And what I mean by that is that either they are directly providing support for projects or infrastructure or people, and indirectly in that in the province of Nova Scotia, there's a significant financial transfer that occurs to the universities, the community college, and the teaching hospitals that provide the basic infrastructure that allow research to occur. And that research may, at the two levels, be separate in that the federal government maybe, or one of the agencies may be providing support for a particular research project with very little provincial input, just like we may pursue a research project with no federal input. They may be connected in that an application is made to a research project that's funded federally, and then the province comes in and is connected to it through, say, a CFI match, or in partnership where two levels of government jointly work together. So we may work with CIHR to identify research projects of joint interest that overlap our mandates. So there are many, many points of intersection between the federal and the provincial level, and in a number of ways in research. So I would say that certainly both levels have a very keen interest in research in a number of different ways. Of course, the outputs, what we're actually learning as a result of the activity of research, as I just mentioned, but also there is this broad idea of the capacity development. It creates a workforce, it creates a vibrant, intelligent community of people that are able to devote their efforts to a variety of challenges and opportunities that exist in society, and it's good to have. And there are a number of indirect effects. It is, in particular, in some of our smaller communities, the community college campuses and those universities have an enormous positive benefit on a much broader community that is separate from research capacity or direct outputs. Two other points. At the federal level, there is significant research capacity for matters of federal jurisdiction. And so the examples I've given are things like climate, defense, and fisheries. DRDC, Defense Research Development Canada, is there to provide capacity to engage in defense research, just like there's significant research capacity related to both climate and fisheries. Whereas at the provincial level, I would characterize that internal capacity as highly uneven, in that there are some provinces that have greater capacity than others, and certain areas within each province get greater attention than others. The needs are no less urgent, and certainly every province is feeling the burden of improving, and I've just picked 4 or 5 down there at the bottom, that there's a huge interest to improve healthcare delivery, education, to adapt to the effects of climate change, improve long-term care facilities. These are all matters of provincial jurisdiction, and if we are to believe the premise that research can provide support to all these different areas, we need to find a mechanism to ensure that we are driving research capacity in support of improvement in each of these different areas. So it is really in that context that we've got this panel today. So how are we going to approach it? So we've got 4 panelists who I'll introduce in just a moment. Each of them will present on an aspect of this subject. Within each of those blocks of time, I strongly encourage you to engage in the discussion in the Q&A, and at the end of each individual panelist's presentation, we'll have a little bit of discussion. Other panelists can interject, and we'll try and engage the audience that way. And then we will save enough time at the end for more general discussion, a bit of summing up, and perhaps some final thoughts from the panelists. So without further ado, I will give you a brief introduction to all 4, and I encourage each of the panelists to add anything else that they wish. So we're going to start with Claire Sanson, who's the Vice President of Programs and Planning at CFI, and she is going to speak to the topic or area of the incentive structure within the federal model of research funding. Next, we'll go to Peter Phillips, who is at the School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan, and his topic is the asymmetrical effect on provinces of vastly different fiscal capacity within a single federal research support system. And I should also point out that Peter, along with the next panelist, David Castle, are just about to release a book titled Science and Innovation in the Canadian Provinces and Territories. So I think probably say they've got a better command of this material than probably just about anyone else. And that book is forthcoming from the University of Toronto Press, either towards the end of 21 or early in 22. Which leads me to the third panelist, the co-author along with Peter, David Castle, who is at the University of Victoria, but is currently a research in residence at the Office of the Chief Science Advisor. And his topic will be system adjustments that can improve the federal-provincial partnership and better support research that benefits all Canadians. And then finally, we have Carole Jabé, who's the scientific director of Fonds de Recherche de Québec Santé. And I should say that she is not actually with us just yet. She was summoned to a meeting of her minister, which does tend to happen. So we're very much hoping that she'll be able to join us when she's free of that to go to her topic, which is how national priorities align or misalign with provincial priorities. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to the first panelist. So Claire.
Yes. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Mr. Leslie. So I would like to say good morning to everyone. And since maybe not all of you are familiar with the approach of the CFI, of the Canada Foundation for Innovation, in terms of federal and provincial matching funds, I will have a short presentation to provide more context. So I trust that people can see my presentation. All good. Okay, so let's roll. So basically, as introduction here, I would like to share with you the mandate of the CFI. So we are here to increase the capability of university, colleges, research hospitals, and nonprofit research organizations in Canada to do world-class research. And we are doing this by investing in research infrastructure. Because of its 40-60 formula, the success of CFI is in fact linked directly to co-funding from the provinces. So 40-60 means that the CFI provides 40% of the requested funds for a meritorious project, and the remaining 60% usually comes as 40% from the province and 20% from other sources. So the CFI invests with the aim of building on Canada's strength. So more specifically, we want to make Canada more attractive to international researchers. So that is, we want to boost the brain gain. And we want to, on the other hand, slow the loss of intellectual capital to other jurisdictions. So we want to slow the brain drain. So also we want to create condition for innovation in science and new technologies that will have benefit for Canada's society and also provide job opportunities for highly qualified personnel. So back to our funding model. So our funding model has been designed to ensure that provinces buy in their participation in research. So the 40% contributed by the provinces really recognize their fiscal capacity, and also this matching funding formula ensures that the funding provided by CFI has a high degree of alignment with provincial research priorities and strategies. To attest to the success of this approach, Over the last 25 years, the CFI has injected $9 billion in research infrastructure. And with the matching funding, that ends up being $20 billion invested. And yes, we are 25 years old and very proud of celebrating a major anniversary this year. So, to ensure that the approach is successful and continues to be successful, the CFI realizes that it has to be very sensitive and open to provincial priorities. And we do that by having ongoing conversation with the provinces and at all stages of our program development, but especially when we are designing new programs and initiative. So the fact that we have these dialogues, especially in the case of new programs, it ensures that there will be no surprises. So we, when we let know the province about our timelines and the way the cash flow will proceed, then the province can also make their own financial planning for their cash flow. So, in closing, I would like to say that we have various degree of engagement from the different provinces. The case of Quebec is notable for the early engagement with us. So I will give the example of our flagship program, the Innovation Fund. So the Innovation Fund has a 3 stages evaluation process. The first stage being the evaluation of the proposals by experts. And in the case of Quebec, they do this separately and then they join the process at stages 2 and 3. And this is to make sure that they are aware of what the institutions are proposing and they feel comfortable that the work is meeting their threshold of quality and also aligns with their strategic goals. So I will stop here. I hope this short overview has helped you to get a sense of our approach, and I'm happy to take questions. So right now, I will stop sharing my screen, and then you can see me as a person. I'm all smiles. I'm happy to hear from you, either I believe in the live Q&A or in the discussion forum. And Mr. Leslie will help me to navigate all of this.
Thank you, Claire. So I'll keep my eye on the Q&A and discussion forum from the audience, but I'll first ask the panelists if anyone would like to seek clarification or provide a different view. I've got a couple of kind of questions before we move, but Peter or David, any thoughts that you'd like to share? No? Okay. So, sorry, Peter, are you going?
No, I was just going to say that's a nice segue to the reality that the provinces are a partner in the way CFI operates. So I'm happy to move into that, and that might generate some commentary in.
Good. And I see that we've been joined by Carol, which is great to see. I'm glad you made it out of your minister's office. Yep, good. Smiles and nodding. That's good. So I know you missed the first part, but Claire has just gone through her presentation. And I just thought I'd pose the question, Claire. You used the province of Quebec as an example, which of course Carol can speak to during her session as well, as an example of early engagement within the Innovation Fund, one of the core programs of CFI. But can you speak to any other examples of provinces that are either, and you don't need to name names, but any that work particularly well or where it's proven to be more difficult to engage?
I think we're maintaining established communication links since a long time. So I think the exchanges between us and the provinces are frank. They are taking place regularly. They are taking place if we need to reach out to them, if they need to reach out to us. So I think, like, communication wise, I think it's all very good. I can mention, though, that it could happen, and it has happened in the past, that provinces make their own decisions based on their own circumstances that would affect our programs. In the past, for example, a province would say, oh, due to limited resources, we are making a choice of the disciplines we want to support, and we do not longer support all the disciplines, because our innovation fund, for example, is open to, it's curiosity driven and open to all the disciplines. So it has happened in the past that provinces would have sort of made decisions that are a bit more limiting in that respect. But this is the very this is the la l'exception qui confirme la règle. This is the exception. So I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, and I think kind of from the perspective of the province of Nova Scotia as a partner with CFI, can certainly confirm that very willing to engage in discussion within the confines of what CFI is able to do, of course. When you mention predictability around funding, it would be remiss if I didn't point out that the difficulty is that in a competitive environment, while we know what CFI's budget is going to be over 4 or 5 years and how much will be attributed to CFREF and CIRC and the various components of GELFs and IFs and all the different programs that you have, the success rate is highly variable. And so until the results of a competition are known, which is often within a budget year, it's very difficult to know how much of the demand is going to come to the province. And so we know what the overall budget is going to be, but we actually have zero insight as to what the demand is going to be at the individual province level, unless perhaps we've engaged much earlier on and are able to direct what project proposals are going into in the first place, and have the financial means to be able to actually fund those that come out the other end as being selected through the merit process that CFI runs.
I totally appreciate the challenge. Maybe one thing that is in the favor of our harmonizing our cash flows and funding cycles is the fact that infrastructure projects are typically rather long in duration. They span several years, and they're within our contribution agreement with the federal government. We have a bit of flexibility sometimes in at the rate at which we actually spend the federal dollars, so which gives a little bit additional flexibility to the province in regulating its cash flow.
Before I move to Peter, who will be the next speaker, I'll just open the invitation up to either David or Carol if they wish to add any thoughts at this time. Okay, seeing none, so go ahead.
I'll just add the step on the demand side matter that you were referring to is a little easier to solve with the innovation fund because it's an enveloped system, so you can actually roughly gauge what the total provincial envelope size would be for the innovation fund, and just assume that it'll be maxed out every year. But the big challenge is on the major research facilities through the MSI program. You can be quite researchers can essentially exercise their academic freedom and put forward a scale proposal. You can be somewhat blindsided and certainly budgetarily off cycle if they've not pre-consulted about their intentions to put in a major initiative.
Mm-hmm. Thanks,
If
David.
I may react to that, thank you for raising that point that the MSI competition is very different from the Innovation Fund. But in all cases, the CFI deals with institutions. So it's the institutions who apply to us. And when, say, their proposal is meritorious and approved by our board, then we move to the stage of award finalization. And then it's the responsibility of the institution to confirm the provincial funding. So we would hope that the communication links between the institutions and the province are also as vibrant and we have between the CFI and the provinces, so that the institutions are sending early signal to the province about what is their intention to apply for.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, we'll move to the next panelist. So Peter, if you're able to share your screen and you can take the floor.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, or good morning, I guess it is. Might be afternoon in some parts of Canada. I apologize if it feels a bit like you've walked into a part of Waiting for Godot. Some of you may have been in the audience last year when Janet Hallowell interviewed David and I about the forthcoming book, which was still forthcoming at that point, but it actually now has a cover and is in the final stages of production. But today I want to bring some of the perspective from the work we've done in collaboration with authors and researchers who are embedded in each province across Canada. One of the enduring messages we got that we've sort of put into a metaphor is that one gets a sense that the federal institutions think they are offering a prix-fixé kind of menu that's nutritionally balanced, aesthetically pleasing, and that we consume it in the way that it's intended. When we look at it from the provincial perspective, what we got was a sense that it was like a crazy smorgasbord, a post-Christmas bacchanal feast where people are starting at different parts of the table. They're piling their plates up with whatever takes their fancy. Some people end up with a lot of good stuff. Some people end up with not a lot. So there's this creative tension between the well-ordered and well-intentioned design of national systems and then the reality that provinces and all their partners, because it's not just provinces that are part of this story, take up and use these things in their interests, not necessarily in the interests of the program designers. So this flows from sort of the reality that the province have their own ideas, their own institutions, and their own interests that generate divergence. And let me talk a bit about some of the asymmetries. In the first instance, while there's been arguably a sustained interest in the idea of innovation and different thematic perspectives on how we can realize it at the federal level, one of the first things that came out of our study over the last 30 or 40 years of effort was that most provinces were only itinerantly interested in innovation. And when they were, it was very partial and incomplete. And so it's uneven both within provinces and between provinces. So there's an attention issue that I think is often forgotten when we look top down through the federal regime. But let me talk about then the institutions and interests that underpin that reality. So I'm going to talk about 5 asymmetries. Provinces at the most basic level have different industrial interests, which generates uneven interest and capacity. Internally, while we're pretty much a service economy now, 3 of our provinces and 2 of our territories still are extremely heavily dependent upon goods production, most of which is exported. So if you look here on this table, you can see this is the distribution of each of the national, provincial, and territorial economies by the sectors they're in. You can see Saskatchewan's at the highest. It has 52% of its GDP generated in goods. Newfoundland's not far behind. Alberta's not far behind. And then 2 of the territories are heavily dependent. And it's a mix of mining, energy, and ag that drives it. And all the rest is pretty much close to the national average. So So there's a dichotomy that's there. Many of the new technologies are about the digital future, and they do fit in the industrial space, but sometimes the fit isn't quite as obvious as others might think. A second asymmetry is that relative to other provinces, there's differences. So many Canadian industries are extremely highly concentrated in one or two provinces. So it's really hard to say we have a national strategy. So let's look at that. If we look across the highlighted boxes are the ones I want to point out. If we look at ag, it's distributed in quite a number of provinces, but particularly Manitoba and Saskatchewan are heavily invested in that relative to their underlying economy. Saskatchewan, which represents about 3% of the national economy, has 21% of the agri-food GDP. So it's a, in terms of location quotient, it's extremely high. If you look at forestry, BC is about pretty close to half, with much of the rest in Quebec. Mining, Saskatchewan's the largest, which surprised even me, even though I'm located in Saskatchewan. Quebec is quite high, but even Quebec's share is smaller than their share of the national GDP. So it's not, or it's just slightly over the national GDP. Energy, more than half of it is in Alberta. So when we talk about a national energy policy, we're really talking about an energy policy in Alberta and then some other things in particularly Newfoundland and Saskatchewan. When we're talking about manufacturing, 70% of it's in Ontario and Quebec, the industrial heartland. There's the rest out there, but much of it is inextricably linked to the primary sectors. And then particularly in services, the most interesting thing is that half of the financial industry, finance, insurance, and real estate, is embodied in the Ontario economy, which means that they have a dominant position in terms of advancing innovations that may be useful in that important sector. A third asymmetry is that partly because of those industrial interests and partly because of the markets we live in, about 92% of the R&D and virtually all of the major industrial R&D performers, so that's anybody who spends more than $10 million a year, they're in one of four provinces. But this isn't particularly impressive. Our businesses are not globally competitive investors in R&D, but you can see that Quebec leads the pack with about 1% of GDP coming from the business sector, a bit over 1. Ontario's less, and then Alberta and BC, and most of the rest, the business sector is not a major contributor to the R&D and innovation effort in the provincial economies. A fourth asymmetry that I think is important to keep in mind is that provinces have uneven fiscal capacity. Part of it's derived by the industrial structure that they have, but partly derived by some of the choices that have been made over the last number of generations. And except in Quebec and Alberta, provinces are relatively modest contributors to the direct funding of R&D. So if we look at this, and I'm going to show two slides here. The first one is, you can see the GDP per capita, but the third column is the one to look at. There are 6 jurisdictions out of 13 that have above average GDP per capita. Newfoundland, the 3 oil provinces, Newfoundland, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and then the 3 territories. And then Ontario is about average, and everybody else is below average in terms of their GDP per capita. When we convert that into sort of flow of funds and availability of funds, you can see that 3 provinces, Ontario, Alberta, and BC, contribute more to the federal treasury. Everybody contributes to the federal treasury, so that's nobody's getting a direct subsidy from this. But you can see as well that translates into some that have a positive cash flow and equalization account, some which do not. So there's different fiscal capacities that are derived from the GDP per capita, and they're reflected largely in those 2 last columns. And what that translates into is differential capacity and sometimes differential interest in contributing to expenditure on R&D. On average, provinces are relatively small contributors, less than 10% or less than 1/10 of 1% of GDP comes from the provincial side, and it's 1/15, 1/17 of all the R&D. The 2 exceptions that make the rule are Alberta, which is heavily invested in a number of research enterprises, and Quebec, which is largely created a parallel and somewhat distinct system of granting agencies that works in collaboration and sometimes in competition with the federal agencies, but creates a province-specific focus on R&D. Oh, there we are. The fifth provincial asymmetry is that the universities are key players everywhere. They're provincial institutions, but they have their own identity and own interests, and they have uneven fiscal capacity that comes from provinces, that comes from their ability to generate competitive grants, such as the CFI grants, and then that their productivity is. The interesting thing, though, is that their productivity is more or less a function of their faculty complement rather than their specific fiscal capacity. So some information from one of our colleagues in Quebec shows that you can see that all the provinces rely relatively heavily on post-secondary education to fund and do R&D, more in Eastern Canada than Western Canada, but they're large numbers relative to other parts of the economy, but also relative to our competitors in the OECD. And the point about granting space is that you can see that broadly provinces generate plus or minus what their per capita share might be across provinces, except with a little bit of exception, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and to a lesser extent, Ontario. But for the most part, that doesn't translate in, there isn't a one-to-one correlation between money and publications. There are some provinces that generate more publications than their grants would imply, but they're not massively different. And I've highlighted, the three that in per capita terms contribute more than you would expect if you were assuming everybody is equally productive. So what's the implications of all this? You've got different attentions, different ideas, different interests, and different institutions to work with. Well, the provinces really do, when you listen to their stories as told by people inside the system, select from this smorgasbord of policies, programs, and initiatives and match them with their interests and differential capacities. So sometimes they go all in one program space and they're weaker in other spaces. The regional agencies are a critical intermediary between the federal system and the provincial systems. The ACOAs, CEDs, CanNor, DevVont, FedNor, Prairie Can, and Pacific Can, which have replaced WD, they all play an important role, but they're not creating the drive. They're really playing a concierge, matchmaker, facilitator role. But the provinces really set the tempo and the direction. It isn't WD that says come on in and we'll do this program. It's they find a match and then work with the provincial agencies or universities. The national programs are often national in name only, because as you look at how they're applied and used and the impacts that they're expecting and delivering in the regions, they're widely disparate. And that makes a challenge for program design, for program implementation, and for program evaluation. There's an outstanding question that David and I sort of came to, which I think leads into some of his conversation, which is that let's set aside all the constraints on provinces and say, what if provinces just could have more fiscal capacity? They're more attentive and more committed to this file, and they find ways of engaging with their local R&D partners. How would they spend those differential resources? Would they align their R&D effort to the existing sources of provincial and territorial GDP? So goods production in some areas, goods, services in others, world-class universities and others, or would they conform to the next wave of priorities and interests identified by the feds? And the answer that came from our collaborators and scholars was that it all depends. That some provinces might align quite nicely with the federal system, and others would once again take federal priorities and federal programs and make them into something that works for their particular set of interests and goals. So let me end my sharing, and we'll return to the group.
Great. Thank you, Peter. And I find, again, encourage the audience who are in to pose any questions in the Q&A or to suggest any topics within the discussion. And I'm interested, Peter, in that the slide towards you had towards the end, which showed the distribution of research dollars by province. So approximately 70% split between Quebec and Ontario. Not surprising. That's where the capacity is, fiscal and research capacity. And I was participating in a previous panel earlier this morning where Jeff Taylor from the Nova Scotia Community College was pointing out the distribution of tri-agency and CFI dollars, or maybe it was CFI dollars between universities and the community college sector, where something like less than 3% is distributed amongst community colleges and polytechnics, even though there are more of those than there are across the universities across the country as eligible recipients for tri-agency. And so the reason I draw that comparison is to illustrate the challenges of any federal system in which you have such a wildly disproportionate capacity, and whether this notion of trying to craft some sort of unified federal position where you have that kind of disparity is really a fool's errand. And so I'm not actually being as cynical as that may sound. I'm really just posing the challenge of trying to come up with something that's going to make sense given the circumstances that we're operating in. I just wonder if you have any thoughts you want to share on that.
I mean, that was pretty clear in as we went across Canada and dealt with our provincial vignettes, that in some provinces there was a triage of institutions where some of them were explicitly designated and supported as research intensive and targeted on generating a proportionate share of federal and other institutional and research support, and others would be then designated more as teaching or community structures, not to prohibit research, but not to necessarily explicitly target it. And so, in some provinces there's only one university, so they do everything. In other provinces like Ontario, there are 50 or 60 universities, and even in BC where there's a dozen or more, there's potential for different roles to be played by different institutions. But when you listen to the institutions and what their visions are, sometimes they don't have that degree of differentiation. They all would like to be moving up the perceived quality scale to moving away from I don't accept this logic, but from just teaching to teaching plus research that's nationally or internationally competitive and ranked. I mean, the interesting thing that comes out of this work is that many of the universities that get ignored as in ranking scales and other things are vitally important in the local innovation system, sometimes more so than the ones that are highly ranked and sort of posited as the anchor to our regional or national systems. So it's a really subtle set of institutions that have multiple interests and they're not all going in the same direction.
Would you say, you mentioned that Quebec is a bit of an exception given the more comprehensive, well-supported diversity of research agency, which I think you characterize are working sometimes in partnership and sometimes in competition with the federal model, that if we set that aside and focus on the others, would you say generally that it is largely the federal system that's setting the table, to use the metaphor that you started with, and that each province is kind of reacting to it? Or do you find that it works in the other direction ever?
I'm not sure that the provinces ever help to structurally define what the feds do, but I think in terms of once the table's set, the question is, do you use the utensils, the plates, and the food on it in the way that was intended by the designers? I often characterize this as the top-down, bottom-up view. When people in Ottawa look top-down at what I do, there's 7 agencies that fund my research space. They all see they own a piece of me and they own a discrete activity, When I look up, I see a portfolio of people who fund a research program, and that's happening at the university level as well. There are some incentives to go for certain types of funding, but at the operational level, they're reasonably agnostic about that because money's fungible. You know, as long as there's enough money to do what curiosity motivates, many scholars and many administrators are happy. Not all, because you know that different money has different value in different contexts. Sometimes in terms of international and national rankings, sometimes in terms of success in, you know, future success and eligibility in program space, but sometimes even at the provincial level, as the provincial post-secondary education programs or institutions or administrations allocate funds across different specific universities and community colleges. You know, they will use different criteria, and so that a dollar is not a dollar for an administrator, but for a scholar, generally they are. I mean, and they're looking to optimize their efforts, and the federal system does, for people who have found the way of working with it, does offer significant opportunities, but it may not be achieving it exactly the same way that the people who designed the programs had intended they would act.
Claire, David, Carol, anything you'd like to interject at this moment? Nothing from David, nothing from Claire, Carol? Nope, nothing. Okay, thank you, Peter. I think we're at quarter past the hour, so maybe we'll move to the next presenter. So next we have David Castle. So I invite you to share your screen, David, and take the floor.
All right, Stefan, that looked good. That's good. Okay. So thanks very much for organizing this this panel. And I know you've been in your post for a little while, but I'd also just like to say that I think it's great that you're heading out to Nova Scotia. So congrats to them and congrats to you. I will just remark, just for the record here, that I'm speaking as a professor of public administration at the University of Victoria, and not on behalf of the Office of the Chief Science Advisor. As Stefan had indicated, that's where I'm currently spending most of my time. But this is my own personal outlook as a free-range academic. So, and then just the last observation I'll make before I get started here is that this slide template has all caps in it, but I am not yelling the title at you. But I do want to talk about some system adjustments that could improve the FPT relationships that would better support research in Canada. So in a way, just to continue the metaphor, this is actually some thoughts, maybe some just questions and provocation that could be done to better set that table that Peter described, because our work on the FPT relations, more or less since the modern incarnation of what was Industry Canada and now ISET, so over about 3 decades, shows that it is really a kind of, it is a bit of a smorgasbord. I don't know about the Bacchanalian part, Peter, but maybe I missed the invitation. But nevertheless, it is a bit of a smorgasbord, and people come and pick and choose what they want from the table. So it has raised some questions about whether or not that table could be set differently in the future, that would have a differential effect on having a more sort of systematic or unified system of funding across Canada. So I just have a few slides here to raise some of these questions that have arisen out of our work. And of course, these questions are not just inherent in our own work; they're sort of part of the general conversation about research funding in Canada. But here's the first question, which is: do FPT matching schemes actually work? They've been around for a while. There have been match funding incentives built into the NCE programs that certainly started in the 1990s, but now it's actually become a dominant factor in other programs. And as we said, that the presumption here is that federal dollars will get provinces and territories to the table. But there's some interesting things to think about in this context. One thing to think about is that there are actually, I think now, almost like a presumption that this will be the norm in major research funding, that there will be some kind of partnership arrangement of match money. And so, for example, you might want to ponder the interesting thing about the Digital Research Alliance Canada, which is no longer under an MSI program anymore, but something like the application of a aggregated 40-60 split still prevails, as if it were still Compute Canada under the MSI program. So the question is, why? And is that a good thing? And is it appropriate for the mission of the Digital Alliance going forward, especially since we know about some of the legacy of Compute Canada having not necessarily always achieved its coast-to-coast-to-coast mandate of providing adequate research supports in the DRI space. So question there. But it does show that there is a sort of presumption that this will be the prevailing modality of funding. I often wonder whether or not we some time ago hit peak match. And I think the comments that Peter was making about provincial capacity for private sector expenditure on R&D raises the question quite dramatically. Certainly when people have been assembling major research funding applications and have private sector partners, much of the contribution to those applications from the private sector comes in the form of in-kind contributions that are valued appropriately, but they are in-kind, or some type of vendor discount. It's the exception for the private sector to actually contribute cash to these kinds of projects. And I think Peter has spoken quite clearly about the reason why that is, which is that there's just very low capacity for BIRD in the system, with some exceptions in some of the provinces some of the time, which goes back to this unequal distribution of resources over time and over geography. And similarly, this issue is also felt by provincial governments, some of which fund little or no R&D, especially when they're struggling fiscally and or have political leadership, which has caused a bit of a slump, or in other times a bit of a peak. And so it can be quite an uneven landscape for the provincial government contributions to R&D. And then the last observations about FPT matching schemes is that it is known among people who have undertaken this kind of work that the transaction costs can be very high in trying to establish and maintain fund matching. And sometimes the scientific leadership of major research facilities spends an inordinate amount of time and money trying to sustain the matching arrangements for their facility. And there's a question there about whether or not those transaction costs are healthy in the system and whether or not they're helping us achieve our R&D objectives. Second question, this is a question really about maybe we need to think about how to set the table differently in the future in Canada. This is a point mostly about major research facilities. So the question here is, do we really need to have an overhaul of the funding strategy? I observe that major research funding is still what I call projectized, and sorry about the abuse of language with the word like that. But what I mean here is that initiatives which are funded under major research facility programs are essentially using funding machinery that is pretty symmetrical to what you would use to fund projects, that is operating expenditures. But this is major capital expenditure, and I think it needs a different vision for what's supported, how it's supported, and how it's reviewed. So there's a question about whether or not 5-year funding cycles, which essentially use the machinery of supporting research projects, is the appropriate vehicle through which to assess, fund, and ultimately review major research facilities. So there's I think room here to think about other models, possibly to think about what a portfolio approach might look like. It's been contemplated on and off over the last few years. I know that the OECD, through the Global Science Forum right now, it has an expert group looking at the question of the very large research facilities, and some of, I think, what they'll be contemplating are what are the criteria that people have been using in different countries to structure a portfolio-based approach and to lead with that. So maybe there'll be some lessons learned from that initiative that we could inform here in Canada. The last thing I'll observe too about just major research facilities and the way that we support and run them is that science principal investigators are the norm. But what I've observed is that science PIs have taken on the role of essentially facility managers or facility directors, and some of them are truly exceptional at doing that. Others experience the pain of having to try to basically be an MRF administrator and still struggling to try to do the science leadership piece, which means they're really doing two major professional activities at once, which is a bit of a stress on them. And then others, I think, are just excellent science PIs, but less adept at managing MRFs. So there is a question here too about whether or not we've set the table correctly in terms of the kinds of competencies that we align with major research facilities, and if we need to think more about having professional infrastructure managers to work with science leadership to help take some of that burden off, but also to just frankly do a better, more globally competitive job of managing major research facilities. Third observation about this is that there has been, over the last several decades, a number of programs that have rolled out in the Canadian system, which involve the concentration of funding resources to smaller number of players in programs that are sometimes actually very directed towards a particular sector or thematic R&D area. So these are the big ones. These are the ones. They're the things like the NCE program, which started over 30 years ago. CFREF, and of course we're coming up on another round of CFREF. It's just been announced this week. C-150 chairs, the major facilities all associated with the supercluster initiatives, and then other targeted programs such as the AI and quantum initiatives, which have been launched as well. Again, the AI initiative really is in 3 major centers at some universities. It would be interesting to see how the quantum computing initiative plays out. So there's the issue here is that this is ongoing. Well, in fact, over the period that this concentration of resources has been going on, Canada's contribution to R&D has been slipping. We're at or a bit below 1.6 of GDP. If you look at the OECD tables, it's been a steady drop over the last several decades, which means that some of the basic discovery research that is being supported in Canada is actually proportionally falling away, and so it is in fact a bit of a zero-sum game for researchers who want to essentially have that continuity of some basic research grants. And at the same time, those basic research grants, I think, have high input costs in terms of assembling the applications relative to the funding that you get from them. Pretty low rates of success, and no guarantee of continuity, even if you've actually had a steady stream of very well reviewed applications in the past. And it might actually, in fact, be rational for some researchers to avoid these programs at some point in their, because the expectation of what they will get out of applying to them is decreasing, not increasing. So there's a calculation there for researchers, but also institutions supporting researchers in their applications. And again, to go back to what we were talking about just previously, there's really no provincial or territorial alternative of substance, except in the case of Quebec, which is parallel, or maybe even by now in excess in terms of its own internal funding to the Tri-Council funding that goes into Quebec. So that's quite a remarkable achievement in providing alternatives to Quebec-based researchers. So 3 questions, then I'll leave you with these. Do matching schemes achieve their objectives? Have we hit peak match? Are we at a point where we should think about a different approach? Should that approach, maybe in the case of MRFs, look more like a portfolio-based scheme? What would that look like? Should we fund and evaluate them differently going forward? And the other thing then is the question of the funding mix. Are specialized programs of concentrated resources a zero-sum game for bread and butter research funding? So as Peter mentioned, you can read all about it in our book when it comes out, but I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. And I'll stop my screen share.
Thank you, David. I think just in the interest of time, and because we keep talking about the Quebec model and how different it is and unique, maybe the timing has worked out quite well, Carol, for you to join us, and perhaps we can go straight to your session before we regroup as a session and engage in a broader discussion. So Carol, maybe I'll turn it over to you at this point, please.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my screen. No, it doesn't work. No, sorry. Okay. So let me try again. Tout l'écran. No. Okay, can you see it? Okay, great. Okay, great. Okay. So thank you very much first for the invitation. Sorry, really to be late. But you will understand maybe why it was so important for me to meet with the different ministries and ministries' office, because it's really the role of the FRQ. And thank you for organizing this panel. I think it's quite interesting, and quite interesting for me to see how, yes, Quebec could be a little bit different from what I saw previously. So I will try to show during this presentation how, as a research funding organization, we determine, we fix our priorities, and how these priorities are really aligned first with the provincial government priorities. And for an organization like mine, it's not that we neglect the national priorities. It's very important, of course, because it's a large chunk of the research funding that goes to the different research team. But it's not the first thing that we will figure out when we design, when we create the programs that we have. So just to go ahead. So the agencies that I'm representing this morning are the Fonds de Recherche du Québec, so the FRQ, and our mandate is really to build research capacity. So the first mandate is not to fund research projects, is really how we can prepare the landscape, the Research Québec landscape, to welcome any national major or not major initiatives that we will have. So if we look at the declination of what I'm just saying, so what we try to do is to promote and provide financial support for research. When we talk about research here, you need to figure out that there are research centers, there are networks, there are this type of capacity that where researchers can work together and access technological platforms or any shared resources to perform the research they want to perform. We also provide financial support for the training of researchers. We start at the level of students, but we also continue to sustain, to support development of researchers' career. And of course, we work for the dissemination of scientific knowledge. And we do this in all research sectors. So I'm representing the health research sector this morning, but we can intervene with society, cultural research, nature and technology, etc., etc. The second part of our mandate is to facilitate partnership at all levels in Quebec, in Canada, and internationally. And I mean, that's interesting to see that it's the second part of the mandate. So if you look at the partnerships that we will have with the national priorities, it comes in some sort of way in second. Here we have the total, you have the total investments that we provide on an annual basis. And you see that the big part of the funding is going to next generations, research careers. So it's almost 50% of our funding. Another big part is going to the research clusters that I was describing. And we have small amount, I mean, it's still small amount of money for research projects. So the only way for us to fund research projects is to have some partnership with other provinces, with federal organisms, or at the level of international collaborations. So how does it work in Quebec? So first, you need, and it was mentioned, the Quebec province has a very deliberate strategy regarding the investment in research and innovation. And it is expressed with this document that we call in French the SQRI. So the strategy for research and innovation. So the Quebec strategy for research and innovation. And the way that the research fund receives our money is that we have a basis budget, an annual basis budget, and we get some special funding from this strategy. And the total amount from the strategy is $2.8 billion. I would love to have all this amount of money going directly to the FRQ, but it's not the case. We have to share with some other organization. And it is an important point here. The FRQ is the main organization to support, to sustain public research, but we have some other organization dedicated to research happening in partnership with private industry. What we're looking for with this strategy is develop talent, skills, next generations, increase Quebec's research capacity. It's really our role, and accelerate, enhance the transfer of commercializations of innovations. So we are just progressing towards a continuum from research to innovation to commercialization. The current strategy is almost at the end, so we are working very hard to get the new strategy, and we have a very special event last week called le Grand Rendez-vous de l'Innovation Québécoise, gathering more than 200 people really to describe, to design what do we want as a province for the research, for innovation. And we were discussing at the provincial level. And when we think at the federal level, it's like, oh, okay, we have to figure out what the federal government is going to announce to be sure that we will be aligned. But it's not the main focus that we have. We have some other strategies, and I'm not going to go through the entire slide. The key message here is that research and innovation is embedded not only in the SQRE that I showed before, but it's also embedded in the different strategies of the Quebec government. So really strategies that the Quebec government is designing, is showing, is publishing, it is a roadmap for the FRQ and for the actions that we will have. So what does it mean building on Quebec's priorities when we have this roadmap, and how can we show some strong leadership to be sure that we develop something that will enhance the competitiveness of our research community? First, and this is some freedom to operate that we have at the FRQ, we can fix the research agenda. And we fix the research agenda with some key areas that we feel are very, very important. So for example, any new program from now, will put as a priority the fact that we should work all together to contribute to the sustainable goals, sustainable development. We will impose in some sort of way the fact that we need to promote, we need to operate with open science. And of course, it will be a priority to have projects that promote equity, diversity, and inclusion, not only in the way that we build the different research teams, but also in the research questions and in the way that we answer the priorities of a diverse society. So it's for the leadership that we can have and that we are able to express. Our main priorities: how do we spend the funds? How do we design the program, the research program? So it's support research training. And you are thinking, okay, she already said this, but it's not in the traditional way. What we want to force, what we want to really promote is to do it in a more intersectorial approach. We also want to be sure that we address our major societal challenges. And I have a next slide based on this. So it's major societal challenges. Some of them are the same challenges that Canada and that the rest of the world. But some challenges, societal challenges, are really the challenges of the Quebec society. To develop international partnership, to advance research practices, and we have some original and pretty creative program for this, and to raise the awareness about research. So 2 slides here to demonstrate our capability, because of the way it is designed in the Quebec province, to have very creative program. So first, I was mentioning address our major societal challenges. 3 challenges: demographic changes, the population of Quebec is similar to the Japanese population. It's really the same effect of aging. So we have to do something. It's true across the world, but it's even bigger in Quebec, as I said, like other jurisdictions like Japan. So we create programs to support Living Lab. We create programs to support cohorts. Some of these cohorts are shared with some Canadian priorities. I'm thinking to the well-being cohorts, but some of others are really dedicated to our province. We create some programs like ODAS, and I'm going to talk about ODAS later on. Regarding sustainable development, climate change, which is a societal challenge, here we really create the Secretary Future Heirs based here in Quebec. But I think that what we do now more and more often is to launch some observatory. So it involves a research community, but it's also involves some public decision maker, citizens, to really look at where we are, where do we want to go. So it's really to follow the social impacts, not only of AI, but of some others. And we have here this very new challenge that we started to embrace, which is the entrepreneurship, but I would say the scientific entrepreneurship. So how can we contribute from a science point of view to the fact that we have to encourage the new generation to really launch companies, startups, develop their ideas in some areas that are not only the academic area. How can we challenge the research practices and approach? So we have programs like ODAS, high-risk projects, explore new territories of knowledge, and built on uncommon collaborations. So it's putting a philosopher with, let's say, a professional some healthcare people, and see what is going to happen when we put these different people in the same room. So it's a very intersectoral approach that we use to develop high-risk projects. We have this dialogue program. It's really here to promote the participation of scientists and especially students in the public sphere. So how to communicate, how to really share the knowledge that we have, and to engage the citizens, the community. That brings me to the engagement program. And what is engagement? It's how we can empower people with science based on evidence-based data. So it's basically about citizen science. So I was talking a lot about the Quebec province and how priorities that we receive from the government, we transfer them to really help and support our research and be leaders in our research. But how does it fit with national priorities? And does it fit with national priorities? My goodness, yes, and heureusement. So it fits because it enhances our competitiveness. So with the strategies that we have with our programs and the way that we build research capacity, we are able to get to a national RFA and get our part, and even sometimes a larger part than the demographic part of the Quebec province in Canada in terms of funding. So we do better than the demographic weight that we are. So it's very, very important, and it's really because of this strategy. We like to think that maybe we have some sort of good influence. Let's say it this way. And for example, ODAS, the programs that I was describing regarding high-risk project, we love to think that maybe it was at the origin of the New Frontier program that is now run by the three council. The agenda of the intersectorial research, it was really in the mind of our chief scientist officer early in 2010, and now it's really written everywhere. And I don't think that there is a lot of areas that we will not think how to answer, to tackle the issue without including intersectorial research and teams. It works the other way, the good influence. And if I'm taking the last strategic plan or the new strategic plan of the CIHR, and the large priorities and space that is given to indigenous people, indigenous research, we have lessons here in Quebec to take from this, and we also have to create some space to really recognize the strengths of minorities. Sometimes it fits with national priorities through partnership, and I'm saying sometimes because it could be more often. I mentioned here the SPORE program, so the strategy for patient-oriented research. It was not a success all the time. The way it was launched, provinces were most of the time outside of the effort, but I think it's becoming better and better. So this is why I decided to put it as a partnership. COVID-19 and the different initiatives that were launched to really address this pandemic, a lot of them were designed having a federal level and provincial level around the table. I was lucky enough to be part of some discussion, so I think it's great. And we have some others that will be announced by the federal government, biomanufacturing, bioinnovation, and so on and so forth. So we can have some alignment, and we should still look for some alignment with national priorities. But for this alignment to be optimal, what I think is that partnership must be discussed on an ongoing basis. The dialogue at the provincial level is permanent, and you were able to see it this morning because of my delay. So we participate in the development of the different strategies there, and I was mentioning it. Research is embedded in the plans, but in an ideal world, we would have a similar approach with the national plans. It requires more dialogue with the federal granting agencies, and I think we can improve here. We have some models that I think are inspiring models to make this connection between provincial agencies, federal agencies, with initiatives like NAFRO. NAFRO is the Alliance of Funding Agencies for Health Research. We work well together. We work well with CIHR. I think that we can find maybe some inspirations with initiatives like this one. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. So we only have just over 6 minutes. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to pose a question and invite each of the 4 panelists to weigh in, and you can either kind of respond to the question or you can kind of provide some concluding thoughts based on what you've heard over the past time. And so what I want to lodge as a question is, research in this country doesn't work unless you have both the federal participation and the provincial participation, financially and otherwise. The system has to get this working properly. Do we think that the incentive structures that have been created in the federal provincial system that we have are providing the appropriate incentives for the research community to respond and engage in research that is most beneficial or most urgently needed outside of the research community itself for society as a whole. So have we kind of got that basic structure correct? So I know I've launched a rather large question, but I'm just going to go quickly around the room in the 5 minutes that remain and see if you have thoughts. So maybe I'll return first to Claire, who started us off.
Thank you, Mr. Leslie. So I think this talks a bit to this dichotomy between mission-driven and curiosity-driven research. And to me, there has to be a balance between the two, because if we only, if we tilt towards too much the mission-driven, then I think we are, maybe we won't have the nice surprises that, sometimes unexpectedly come from the curiosity driven research, and many times the curiosity is sort of predates the mission driven research. So I think it's there has to be an equilibrium at all times.
Okay, thank you. Peter?
Short answer is no. Is it right? The couple of things. I don't think tinkering is going to do it. I mean, we've been tinkering for 25 years trying to get the right rules to motivate people to do what the federal government has set as priorities and processes. I agree 100% with Claire that we need a portfolio, but within those portfolios, I think we need to get a bit smarter about how we construct the competitions. In some cases, it may be better just to have a lottery and distribute the capital, because as David points out, the transaction costs are just too high for the amount of money we're distributing. In other cases, leveraging may be important, but make it real leveraging. I mean, I've been on probably 15 large scale projects. The vast majority of them are not real leverage. I mean, occasionally there's a cash transfer, but most of the time it's in kind marking up the effort. And that adds massive cost, but no benefit. It actually makes there's a behavioral argument that if you monetize engagement, you actually trivialize it and you make it less effective. So by monetizing every one of our exchanges, saying I need you to sign this note saying it's worth $1,000 turning up today, I've actually trivialized it, because to them it's worth a lot more, or they don't turn up. So this is part of the challenge we have. We've got to think smarter about distributing what are scarce resources.
Thank you, Peter. David, we've got 3 minutes left on the clock, so you use maybe half.
Okay, so short answer is no. But I'll come at this in a slightly different way, which is that we had this kind of food and meal metaphor, and it sort of what I want to say goes back to something that Peter had said about, from the perspective of a researcher, they have long-term, possibly even career-long programmatic interest in doing certain things, and their objective fundamentally is to have continuity of intellectual activity, to be able to do their research, and if it requires supports, they will find supports possibly can. But unfortunately, from the researcher point of view, I think that they oftentimes feel like they're not really getting invited to a table. They're sort of scrounging around on the forest floor, sort of being facultative consumers of whatever they can find to make sure that continuity of research activity endures. And most of them are actually, because cash is fungible from their perspective, really don't care that much about which program it is or which door they have to go through. They're really just focused on getting their work done. And that's why I think that the architecture that we have in Canada is for the last 30 years, we've been just adding things to it rather than consolidating and focusing. And it's becoming increasingly complex without actually the system growing in size, which means that we're just introducing all of these transaction costs into the system. And we really do, I think, need a major reset. And I think, listening very closely to Carol's excellent presentation, I found myself having a thought experiment which is to go back in time and erase the organic way in which all of the their very idiosyncratic response to the federal incentives. And what would it look like if we actually just replicated with scaled size the system that Quebec has in place now in all of the different provinces? Architecture drove the priorities as opposed to just the willy-nilly adaptation that has happened over the years in each of the provinces and territories.
We're just about to lose our time, so I'm going to thank each of you in turn. Thank you so much for everyone who participated, and I wish everyone a good rest of the day. I hope that this conversation, which we've started here, perhaps when we're back in a mode of being able to meet in person once again, it would make sense, as Carol said, NAFRO, the National Alliance of Provincial Health Research Organizations, perhaps we should bring together the concept of all of the provincial research organizations in a broader conversation, as many of you have said. So Carol is trying to jump in. We're over time.
Just one, redefine what is excellence. We need to redefine what is excellence. I stop here.
No argument there. So thank you again to Claire, to Peter, to David, and to Carol. And I hope everyone in the audience, we've captured the questions that didn't get time to be posed to the group. And we will see this discussion continue. So thanks very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you for the opportunity.